Schools across Sudan to close on Wednesday. This after 5 students were killed when security forces opened fire to disperse a protest earlier this week. As the world's 2 largest economies resume trade talks in Shanghai, the US president accuses China of failing to deliver. And the French Prime Minister dismisses claims that police heavy-handedness caused the death of a man in the western city of Nantes last month. This after a body was recovered from the Loire River and has now been identified as that of Steve Caniso. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. First, thousands of protesters have taken to the street across Sudan. They're protesting the violent tactics used yesterday to disperse a demonstration. 5 high school students were left dead after security forces opened fire, and schools throughout the country are set to shut on Wednesday. Selina Sykes reports.
Marching in defiance, thousands of Sudanese school children take to the streets in the capital Khartoum on Tuesday to condemn the previous day's bloodshed. On Monday, a student-led protest in the city of El Obeid ended in massacre, according to a doctors' committee allied with the pro-democracy movement. Security forces opened fire on the crowd, killing 4 teenagers and an adult. UNICEF called on the Sudanese government to launch an investigation, saying no child should be buried in their school uniform. Sudan's military leader and the acting governor of the region have condemned the killings.
The events escalated quickly. This led to 5 deaths. We ask God to bestow His mercy on them and to comfort their families and beloved ones. An investigation has been opened.
The violence came as protest leaders were due to hold talks with generals in this hotel in Khartoum on the final details of transitioning to civilian rule. A power-sharing deal reached earlier in July agreed on the establishment of a new governing body of 6 civilians and 5 generals. Instead of attending the talks, protest leaders visited El Obeid where the 5 people were killed. The ruling Transitional Military Council has imposed a curfew in the region, while schools have been ordered to suspend classes.
Algeria's army chief is ruling out preconditions for talks to break the political impasse, saying there's no more time to lose. Now, protests continue to grip the country following the ouster of the former president, with demonstrators calling for those linked to Abdelaziz Bouteflika to step aside. Celebrations are being held across Morocco to mark King Mohammed VI's 20th anniversary on the throne. Towns and cities have been decked out with flags, while newspapers have published editorials praising the monarch's achievements. But there's also been dissent, with some pointing to inequality and the high rate of youth unemployment. The monarch, meanwhile, has called for a government reshuffle, saying Morocco's development policy won't meet the needs of its citizens without new blood.
It's true that we could not accomplish everything we wanted, but we're determined to stay the course, to build on what's been done, by sticking with the dynamics of current reforms and by correcting the failings that we observe in the field.
Now, earlier I spoke to William Lawrence, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University, and asked him if Morocco's powerful king will start to cede some of his control.
He's been very, very gradually ceding power since he came to power in 1999 in many areas. The problem is that the progress has been so glacial that that creates a lot of frustration, and that led to both the Arab Spring protests, Morocco's largest protests in a long time, and the Hirak protests of 2016 and 2017. It's a very important gesture today that the king let over 4,000 prisoners go, including many of the 400 still remaining in jail who were involved in the Hirak movement, the protest movement in the north. And these types of gestures, along with other concessions to civil society, are where we could see some progress in the coming months and years.
Given that he pardoned hundreds of prisoners, has that sort of calmed public anger, if you will, or is that still simmering on the surface?
Well, obviously, there's a great diversity of opinion in Morocco, and anger is relatively localized in certain protest communities. Certainly, people will feel very happy if their family members get out of jail, and civil society organizations may feel reinvigorated. And then that complicated process begins of sort of coercion and co-optation that we see in many of Morocco's neighboring and brother countries, and the degree to which Morocco can sort of bring co-opted civil society into the system, get them working on reform programs, is what the king wants. He also announced today a committee that's supposed to work on a number of socioeconomic issues to address anger of, again, these crowds that are protesting. And he, of course, wants a cabinet reshuffle. But again, it's the pace of change that often hasn't kept pace with expectations.
William Lawrence speaking to me there earlier. Now, protests erupted in Hong Kong after authorities charged 44 activists with rioting. It's the first time the rioting charge has been used since protests erupted over a controversial extradition bill with China. Rioting carries a maximum 10-year sentence in Hong Kong, and the activists themselves allege that they've done nothing wrong. Now, earlier this Tuesday, protesters blocked train services during rush hour traffic in the city. Now, the US and China have opened another round of trade talks, the first since Donald Trump and Xi Jinping agreed to a truce at last month's G20 summit. Expectations of a breakthrough in Shanghai are slim, and the US president has already accused Beijing of not following through on its previous commitments. Our business editor Kate Moody has more on the story.
Just hours after U.S. negotiators touched down in Shanghai, Donald Trump began tweeting at length about his admittedly low expectations for the outcome. He accused China of always changing the framework of the deal at the last minute and of reneging on its commitments. Here you can see he says that the country hasn't showed signs of buying U.S. agricultural goods as previous drafts of a deal had promised. And he says that the Chinese economy is suffering more than America's. Now, Chinese data actually indicate that farmers there have indeed resumed purchases of U.S. soybeans and pork, while Washington has lifted tariffs on 110 Chinese-made industrial goods, and it's been easing its restrictions on the tech giant Huawei. The fact that these talks are taking place in Shanghai is seen as a symbolic, possible sign of progress. It's a nod to a breakthrough on trade issues with the EU that took place 12 years ago.
Kate Moody there reporting. Now, the French Prime Minister has dismissed claims that heavy-handed tactics used by police in the western city of Nantes contributed to the death of a young man. An autopsy done on a body recovered in the Loire River yesterday has been identified as that of Steve Canisso. The 24-year-old went missing after police raided a music festival on the banks of the river just last month. Kathy Clifford reports.
Missing for 39 days, his body was identified this Tuesday after being found in the Loire River in the French town of Nantes.
The family are in a considerable state of shock because the discovery of this body makes the death of their son or brother official.
No one had seen or heard from Steve Canisso since the early hours of June 22nd. He'd been celebrating the Fête de la Musique, an annual evening of music across France, when police moved in to bring a free techno concert to a close, resulting in clashes with some of those attending, which led to 14 concertgoers falling into the nearby Loire River. 13 were pulled to safety, but 24-year-old Steve Canisso couldn't swim. His disappearance has brought French police's crowd management tactics back into the spotlight, drawing fierce criticism. Several protests attracted hundreds onto the streets of Nantes, calling for justice for Steve and an end to police violence. French police were already under fire for heavy-handed treatment of yellow vest anti-government protesters after the movement erupted last November. Nantes prosecutors say they've opened an investigation for manslaughter. Meanwhile, the results of an internal inquiry were revealed by French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe on Tuesday.
It indicates that in light of known facts at the time of publication, I quote, "A link cannot be established between the intervention of police forces and the disappearance of Mr. Steve Maya Canisso."
The Prime Minister said certain grey areas remained and that the Inspector General of the administration would now look further into the organisation of the event.
19 people have been killed on the outskirts of the Pakistani city of Rawalpindi, this after a military plane crashed during a routine training exercise. The cause of the plane crash remains unknown, but an investigation has already been launched. Simon Harding reports.
A strange but deadly incident. A small Pakistani military plane crashed on Tuesday morning, plummeting into a residential area of Rawalpindi and setting fire to several homes. Eyewitnesses said the plane had already been ablaze whilst airborne.
I was awake when the plane flew over my house, and it was already on fire in the air. The sound was so scary. It was a small plane.
It was 2 a.m. when the incident happened. The tail of the plane was on fire, and it took barely 2 or 3 seconds to crash into 4 houses near my house. And the 5th one, it burnt it down to ashes.
No reason has been given for the aircraft's failure, but 18 people are now confirmed dead. Pakistan has a dark flight safety record, with 3 major crashes in the past 9 years. In 2010, 152 people died when a private airliner crashed near Islamabad, the worst air disaster in Pakistani history. Rawalpindi, which houses the headquarters of the Pakistani army, has also been the site of a previous accident. In 2012, 121 passengers lost their lives as a plane crashed in bad weather conditions.
Lawmakers in India approved a bill to end the Muslim practice of instant divorce. The move comes 2 years after the Supreme Court ruled that triple talaq violated the constitutional rights of Muslim women. India's Prime Minister, meanwhile, praised the bill's approval, saying it will improve equality in society. Wasim Korne reports.
A step toward the empowerment of women. That's how Indian Law Minister Ravi Shankar Prasad described the abolishing of instant divorce in the country. Instant divorce is a practice followed by adherents of Hanafi Sunni Islamic schools. It allows men to divorce their wives by saying talaq, the Arabic word for divorce, 3 times. Most of India's 170 million Muslims are governed by the Muslim personal law for family matters, allowing talaq to be recognized by Indian law. After India's upper house approved the bill, Prasad addressed lawmakers.
Let's understand the changing profile of India, that people are willing to support a positive initiative for change if the intention is fair.
Critics accuse the ruling BJP party of discrimination against Muslims, even though several Muslim groups have spoken out against instant divorce in the past. India's more powerful lower house approved the bill last week. It will now become law after the country's president approves it. India is now among some 20 countries, including neighboring Pakistan and Bangladesh, that have banned the practice.
Now, it's an invention which prevented millions of ship collisions, and now France is hoping to secure World Heritage status for a lighthouse off the country's Atlantic coast. Thomas Waterhouse has a story.
It's been nicknamed the Versailles of the sea. Standing over 67 metres tall in the Gironde estuary, the Corduan lighthouse has been guiding boats since it was first lit in 1611. France is now hoping the beacon will shine bright in the future as its official candidate for a World Heritage Site prize. The choice comes as no surprise to this former keeper.
The architecture is amazing. It's the only lighthouse with a royal apartment and a chapel. When I first came here as a former stonemason, you can imagine how I instantly fell in love with this monument.
And he's not the only one to have fallen for its charms. Each year, 28,000 tourists board a boat and scamper their way over the sands to visit the lighthouse and its lavishly decorated and recently renovated interiors. And many race up the 301 steps to take in the stunning views over the ocean.
Getting World Heritage status will put our region and the Charente and Gironde coastlines in the spotlight, and it'll boost tourism.
The lighthouse and its fans will have to wait until July next year, when UNESCO's committee meets to decide on the final list of new World Heritage sites.
That's it from me. Thank you very much for watching.